There's a moment, and you'd know it if you'd ever felt it, where something ordinary goes wrong so quietly that nobody catches it except one person. That day, the one person was 7 years old. It was the kind of Tuesday London does in late October, where the sky can't commit. Not raining, not sunny, just gray and close and a little damp, the kind of cold that gets into your collar and stays there. The trees along the mall had gone copper and brown, and the leaves hadn't all fallen yet, so they hung there looking sorry for themselves, flipping over when the wind came through. I was standing about 40 meters from the south gate, not close actually, enough to be in anyone's way but close enough to see everything. I do that sometimes, which go and stand near the palace, not to photograph it or tick it off a list, but just to watch. And there's something about that place. The sheer weight of it, the way it just sits there like it's been waiting for you, namely, that makes you want to be still for a minute. The tourists were doing what tourists do. Phones up, backs turned to the gate for selfies, which always strikes me as a strange instinct. Turning your back on the thing you came to see. Actually school group from somewhere, France, I think, from the snippets of language drifting over, was clustered near the railings, all high-vis vests and clipboard-carrying teachers trying to count heads for the 4th time. Guard duty that morning had fallen to a young man I'dn't seen stationed there before. He was tall, impossibly still the way they trained them to be, the bearskin hat sitting straight and perfect, the red tunic without a crease, and the rifle at his side at exactly the angle a ruler would approve. His face was the mandatory blank, and not cold, exactly. More like a painting of a man. You look for the person inside the uniform and you can't always find the seam. His name, I found out later, was Corporal Dean Hallowell. 23 years old. He'd been on ceremonial duties for 11 months. He was good at it, good at the stillness, which good at the performance of indifference. And then the I think girl found him. She appeared from the direction of the tourist cluster, which is why nobody thought much of it at first. To be fair, small. Plus, dark coat, yellow wellies that were too big for her, the left one flapping at the ankle where the sole had started to peel. Red scarf wound twice around her neck, hair in 2 plaits that were coming undone at the bottom, the way plaits always do by mid-morning. She walked toward the guard with absolute purpose, not the shuffling, look-around purpose of a child trying to get someone's attention. The straight line, eyes forward, got something to say purpose of a person who has already decided to do a thing and is simply completing it now. She stopped directly in front of him. He didn't look at her. You're not supposed to look at them. Kind of, you face forward. You hold your position, which you perform your impassivity for the cameras and the crowd. But she didn't move. She stood there for a count I estimated at nearly 15 seconds, which is a long time to stand in front of a large uniformed man and simply wait. Most adults would have lost their nerve or walked off or taken a photo. She did none of those things. She said something. I was too, I guess. Far away to hear it. I saw her mouth move. I saw her small chin come up the way children's do when they're trying to be taken seriously by people taller than them, which is everyone. Like Corporal Hallowell didn't move. She said it again, which this time she reached out one hand, her right, still in a tiny navy glove, and touched the side of his sleeve. Not pulling. Look, plus just contact, just, I need you to hear me, which something shifted in him, not dramatically, not even visibly to most people watching, but I was close enough to notice. The line of his jaw changed, a tiny contraction, the kind that happens when a person's brain suddenly activates behind eyes that are supposed to be decorative. Basically, he looked down, not a full break of position. His head barely moved. But he looked at her. She pointed. Not toward the palace, not at anything picturesque or obvious, and she pointed down the side road that runs alongside the eastern perimeter, the narrow service road that delivery vehicles used, the one behind the iron fencing and the hedge line where tourists didn't tend to linger. I followed the direction of her finger. There was a van. Plus, white, transit-sized, the kind that could belong to anyone. Catering, maintenance, event sort of. Crew. You see that category of van 100 times a day in central London and your eye slides right off them. This one had been parked there for... And I'd to think about this, actually try to reconstruct my morning, at least 45 minutes, possibly longer. I'd walked past it on my way to this spot and hadn't registered it as wrong because nothing about it was visually wrong. It wasn't marked. It wasn't running. It wasn't ostentatiously suspicious the way you're told to look for. It was just there in a way that was, I realize now, slightly too there. Parked at a particular angle, not quite flush with the curb. Nose tilted a few degrees outward, the way you might position something if you wanted a clear sight line to the gate, or a clear exit path from a standstill. The girl was still pointing at it, still talking to Corporal Halliwell. Plus, he looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way you can see a person actually processing. And then he looked at the van. A beat. Then he did something that I've thought about many times since. He didn't break protocol. He didn't abandon his post or wave his arms or make a scene. He pressed a point on his uniform just below his left collarbone, his radio mic. I understood later. And he spoke. 4 words, maybe 5, barely a movement of his lips. Whatever he said it like someone who had already decided he'd rather be wrong and embarrassed than right and silent. The girl hadn't moved. She was watching him with an expression I can only describe as the specific satisfaction of a child who has been believed by an adult. That particular relief and... He looked down at her again. Like he said something. She nodded. He said something else. She TBH, turned around and walked back. Not to the tourist group, which surprised me, but to a bench near the path, where a woman in a gray coat was sitting. Upright with both hands in her lap, watching the whole thing with an expression like someone who had expected this to happen and was now simply waiting for it to resolve. Her mother, I assumed, and her mother who had sent her. Plus who had noticed what grown adults trained to notice things had not noticed, and who had sent her 7-year-old daughter, in the yellow wellies and the coming undone plaits, to tell the guard because she was too far from the entrance to make it herself in time. In time for what? None of us knew yet. Within 4 minutes, the atmosphere near that service road changed in the way atmospheres change when people who are paid to handle things arrive. Well, not sirens, not running, nothing that would cause the school group to scatter or the selfie takers to panic. Just more men, which and then a particular quality of stillness around the van. I stayed where I was. Most people had no idea anything was happening. The guard had resumed his position. The girl was sitting on the bench eating what appeared to be a cereal bar her mother had produced from her bag, feet swinging 6 inches off the ground, watching with bright, specific attention. Corporal Dean Halliwell didn't move. Plus, but behind the painting of him, something was different now. The jaw was set in a new way. The eyes, which were supposed to be fixed on the middle distance, had a particular quality of alertness in them, the kind you can't train into a person, the kind that either exists in someone or doesn't. He had heard a child who everyone else had been too tall to hear. That, before anything else happened, was already the thing. End of part 1. The first plainclothes officer arrived walking like a man who'd decided to stroll, hands loose, pace unhurried, and the kind of deliberate normalcy that is its own category of suspicious if you know to read it. He went past the van without stopping, continued down the service road, checked his phone, turned back. The second, pretty much, officer came from the opposite direction. They converged on the van the way tides converge, without hurry, without announcement, and with the particular certainty of things that have already decided to meet. I watched from the path. A pigeon-like walked across my foot. TBH, I didn't move it. Here's what I knew standing there before any of it was confirmed. The van had no plates visible on the rear. I'dn't noticed, sort of, that from distance, But once the officers were near it and I was paying the right kind of attention, it was obvious. The rear plate bracket was empty. Just the gray rectangle where something was supposed to be and wasn't. The side windows were blacked out, which is legal for certain commercial vehicles, and therefore easy to dismiss. And the van was running, not audibly to be fair from where I stood, but you could see it in the shimmer above the exhaust pipe if you looked. I looked sort of now, which it had been idling, engine live for... I went back through my morning again, tried to anchor the timeline. At least as long as I'd been standing there. Which was basically pushing an hour. A running, in my opinion, van, parked, no plate, angled for exit, outside the palace. 7-year-old child in yellow wellies. Corporal Dean Hallowell, 23, 11 months on ceremonial duties. The chain of it. The woman on, I guess, the bench, the mother, had not moved from her bench. She was watching with a steadiness that reminded me of someone reading a page they'd already read once before. Her hands were still in her lap. The cereal bar wrapper had been folded small and was held in the girl's left fist. I walked over. I don't know why I did it. I just did. Plus, she looked up when I arrived, at the edge of the bench. Not startled, just present. To be fair. "Is she yours?" I said, which is a strange question about a child sitting 12 inches away from you, but people say strange things. The woman nodded. "She spotted it herself?" I asked. There was a pause, the pause of a person deciding how much of a thing to give a stranger. "We walked past it on the way in," she said. Her voice was measured, northern, Leeds or Bradford, I thought. She asked why the driver was watching the gate. I looked. And then I looked at the van and She stopped, pressed her lips together once. I couldn't get her to the entrance in time to tell someone properly. So, well, I told Mia to go. I looked at the girl, Mia, apparently, who was still watching, in my opinion, the van with the focused calm of a person watching something on television, following the plot, plus waiting for the next thing. "How old is she?" I asked. 7, 7.5. She said the second part slightly automatically, the way parents add the extra months, because to the child the months matter enormously. "Does she, TBH, do this often and notice things?" The woman looked at me then, really looked. There was something in it. Not quite amusement, not quite pain. "Her dad's in the police," she said. "Was in the police." The past tense landed. I didn't ask. Plus, Mia turned, to her mother at that point, apparently done with the van for a moment, and said, in the easy, direct way of children who haven't learned yet to soften observations, "They've called someone else. Look, I think van's going to open." Her mother and I both looked. The rear doors of the van were opening, not violently, not in any cinematic fashion. Slowly, the way you open a door when you want to show the person outside that you aren't a threat. The officer nearest the van had one hand up, palm outward, that universal language, and was speaking in low, even tones I couldn't hear from my distance. A man got out, middle-aged, work trousers, a high-vis vest, one of those fleece jackets with a company logo that was too small to read from where I stood. He had his hands raised slightly, not above his head, and just held out and open, the gesture of a person who knows what the situation looks like and wants to communicate that he's aware of how bad it looks. The officers were honestly speaking to him. He was nodding, gesturing at the van and nodding again. One of the officers looked inside the van. The officers, body language didn't change in the way it would change if the contents were what everyone nearby had, in some unspoken collective way, been bracing for. There was, in my opinion, no sharpening, no backward step, no reaching. In my opinion, shoulders dropped a fraction. Not dramatically, just whatever the worst version was, this wasn't it. But neither did anyone relax entirely. The officer kept talking to the man. A third officer had arrived and was photographing the van. License plate, or lack of it, and the inside methodically. The man in the high-vis pointed at the van again, pointed at his phone, got out his phone, showed the officer something on the screen, which, Mia said, "They're not going to arrest him." "No," her mother said, "but something's still wrong." Her mother looked at her sideways. "What makes you think so?" Mia pointed, that same direct, unself-conscious point, at the lead officer. "He's still writing things down. If it was fine, he would have stopped." She was right. He hadn't stopped. What it was, as I pieced it together over the following hour from a combination of watching and a brief conversation with a police liaison, officer who came to take a statement from the mother and, at the mother's nod, from me as well. The van driver was legitimate. Contracted catering company, genuine booking, genuine vehicle. And he had paperwork on his phone. In my opinion, he worked there. Plus, but kind of, the rear plate, the missing plate, wasn't his doing. It had been removed, recently from the state of the bracket and not by him. He hadn't noticed. It had been taken sometime between him parking at his depot that morning and arriving at this spot. A simple bracket, 2 screws, 30 seconds of work. Someone had removed it specifically from a catering van that had a confirmed booking near the palace, which meant someone had known about the booking, which meant something else entirely. The driver wasn't the problem. The driver was, and I remember the liaison officer's word, precise and measured, a mechanism. The van was a mechanism. The removed plate was the signal that the mechanism had been tampered with by someone who wanted a legitimate vehicle with a confirmed access booking to arrive at this location today, unregistered, untrackable. For, well, what purpose, they didn't say to me. Probably because they didn't know yet. Possibly because even honestly, if they did, they'dn't. What I know is this. The discovery of the missing plate that morning at that location triggered a review of every vehicle scheduled for access to the palace estate that day. 4 vehicles in total. 1 was held for additional inspection and cleared. The other 3, were waved through only after officers had physically accompanied each one from the outer checkpoint. Whatever had, for what it's worth, been intended, and I'm not going to pretend I know the full shape of it, because I don't. It didn't happen. Walked back past the bench on my way toward the gate. Mia was, standing now, scarf unwound from her neck and hanging from one hand, plaits fully undone now so that her hair was just loose and a bit tangled from the wind. She was watching a pigeon with the complete focus she'd applied to everything else that morning. "Mia," I said. She looked up, and no wariness, just direct. "That was very brave," I said. "Walking up to him like that." She considered this. "He had a nice face," she said. "You can see it if you stand close. Under the hat." She looked back at the pigeon. I didn't have anything else to add to that. Corporal Dean Halliwell had returned to his complete stillness by this point. The painting of a man, which the immovable thing. But if you pretty much... He stood close and looked up at his face from a child's eye height. Maybe you could see it. TBH, the seam. End of part 2. Nothing that matters announces itself. That's the thing I kept coming back to. Sitting on the tube home that afternoon, coat damp now where the not-quite rain had finally decided to commit, watching my own reflection in the black window opposite, that was the thought that kept turning over. Nothing that matters announces itself. Not the van, not the missing plate, not the thing someone had intended and didn't achieve, not Mia in the yellow wellies walking straight back through a crowd of adults toward a uniformed man whose job it was to be a monument. None of it announced itself. I went back the following week. I don't know, in my opinion, exactly why. And some version of wanting to close a circle that probably didn't have a close in it. Do you know that sometimes go back to places where something happened, as if the geography still holds the shape of the event and you can stand in it one more time. The same stretch of pavement. The mall. Copper-leaved look. And cold. The tourists thinner now that the school trip season had wound down. A different guard on duty at the gate. Same uniform. Plus, same bearskin. Same manufactured stillness. I didn't approach him. I just stood there for a while like I'd before. Watching. Being still in the way the place seemed to invite. A couple nearby were trying to get their toddler to look at the palace for a photograph, and the toddler was refusing with the iron conviction that only very small children manage, then turning away every time they turned him back, determinedly interested in a puddle 2 feet to his left. The puddle won. I watched that for a minute and felt something I couldn't name. A few days after the incident, a contact of mine, I'm not going to say more than that, passed along a single piece of information, not for publication, not for broadcasting anywhere, just in the spirit of one person letting another person know that the thing they witnessed mattered. The investigation look into how and why that license plate had been removed was ongoing. The catering driver had been fully cleared and had, by all accounts, been fairly shaken by the whole thing. He'd been, using that route and that booking for 2 years without incident. He felt, my contact said, like someone had borrowed his life for a morning without asking. But the detail that lodged in me, the one I couldn't put down, was this. The investigation had established that the plate had been removed at some point during a 30-minute window that morning in a depot car park, while the driver was inside doing his pre-route check. In broad daylight, plus, in basically, a functioning commercial facility with other people present. Not a sophisticated operation. Not invisible, which just brazen enough, ordinary enough, and brief enough that nobody had thought to look at it twice. A plate bracket, 2 screws, 30 seconds, and then a legitimate van with a legitimate booking heading toward a location that didn't need to know it couldn't be identified. It had been designed, my contact said, to slide through every adult filtering system, every trained eye, every procedural checkpoint. They'd every professional habit of mind. It had not been designed to survive a 7-year-old girl in yellow wellies who noticed that the driver was watching the gate. I thought about that for a long time. About the gap between what we train adults to see and what children, untrained, look at directly. The driver watching the gate. Not the van, not the plate, not the angle of the vehicle or the timeline of its presence. The driver's eyes and where they were pointing. A child looks at faces first. Always faces. They haven't learned yet to look at documents and brackets and protocols. Sometimes that's the only working system. I think, found out about the letter in the last week of November. Not from my contact this time, and from a piece in a small, not especially prominent section of a news website, the kind of story that gets filed at the bottom of the local news tab between a charity bake sale and a planning dispute, and which is interesting to approximately 200 people, one of whom happened to be me, searching by that point for it. Corporal Dean Hallowell had been formally commended by his regiment for the incident on that Tuesday morning in October. The commendation was, as these things typically are, crisp and procedural in its language. Quick recognition of a potential security concern, appropriate escalation through correct channels, conduct reflecting well on the regiment and the standards of ceremonial duty. I think procedure, channels, standards, the language of institutions, which is a language designed to make individual human choices sound like the natural output of well-maintained systems. He had heard basically a child, which that was the choice. He had let a 7-year-old girl in a coming undone school uniform tell him something, and he had listened to her, and he had pressed his radio mic and said the 4 or 5 words that started everything else moving. The institution commended him for his procedural competence. What the institution couldn't commend him for, because institutions don't have language for this, was the fact that in a fraction of a second, standing rigid in a uniform designed to make him a symbol rather than a person, he had chosen to be a person. Mia didn't get a commendation. Of course she didn't. I guess, plus she's 7. But her mother received a phone call. formal in its pleasantries, brief in its substance. An expression of gratitude from an office that my contact described with admirable economy as the sort of office that doesn't usually make phone calls. Her mother told the caller that Mia had been sleeping fine, thank you, and had mostly moved on to a new interest involving the migratory habits of European starlings, which she'd read about in a library book. The caller apparently didn't know what to do with that. The call ended. I went back to the palace one more time after that. Middle of December now, the Christmas lights up along the mall, the tourists doubled again with the seasonal, honestly, pull of the city, everyone slightly louder and pinker-cheeked and wrapped in more layers. I stood in my usual spot, different guard again. I didn't know this one. The young, broad-shouldered, the bearskin sitting at a slight angle, the wind kept nudging, and he kept not adjusting. The bench, where pretty much the mother and Mia had sat, was empty. Cold, wet, unoccupied. A pigeon was standing on one end of it like a small, indifferent ornament. A school group arrived while I was standing there. Younger ones this time, maybe 6 or 7, in high-vis bibs, holding a rope that stretched between 2 teachers at either end, keeping them linked and together the way you do with children near roads. They were very loud and very delighted, faces upturned at the palace, at the guard, at the lights strung through the trees. One of them, near the front of the rope, tugged her teacher's sleeve and pointed at the guard. The teacher glanced over and said something patient and distracted, and the child kept pointing and kept saying something, louder now, and the teacher finally really looked, and nothing was wrong this time. The child was just pointing because there was a man in a giant hat, and that is objectively worthy of pointing at. The teacher laughed. The child bounced on the spot. The group moved along. I watched them go, and here's what I believe, having stood on that street and turned the whole thing over more times than I can account for. What Mia did wasn't remarkable in the way that word usually gets used. It wasn't supernatural perception or special bravery or cinematic heroism. She was a 7-year-old child who had learned in the particular grief and love education that comes from being the daughter of a police officer who was a police officer. To look at where people's eyes were pointing. Look. Now that's all. That's the whole thing. She looked. She looked at the ordinary invisible van, and instead of her gaze sliding off it the way all the adult gazes did, she noticed that the man inside it was watching the gate. And then she walked in her 2 big yellow wellies toward the tallest, most intimidating-looking, most deliberately impassive man in her field of vision, and she told him. Because her mother said to. Because her father would have. The last thing I'll tell you is this. I was leaving, collar up, December cold finally having declared itself properly. And I passed the guard on the way out. Not Corporal Hallowell, and this was someone else entirely, this December afternoon. Someone I'd no story about. I looked up at him as I passed. He was looking straight ahead, fixed. The painting of a man. But at the corner of his jaw, and I'm aware this could be the cold, or the wind, or my imagination filling in things it wanted to find, there was the smallest movement, the subtlest working, I think, of muscle, sort of, not at me, honestly, not at anything. Just a man, like, inside a uniform, being a person as quietly as he could manage. That's enough. That's in the end, all any of it was. A woman noticed, actually, something she couldn't reach. She sent the person she trusted most. The person she trusted most was 7 years old and hadn't learned yet to be too tall to listen. And the man in the hat heard her. End of part 3. The thing is, end of story.